Sosuke Aizen is one of the most iconic villains in anime and manga, and over the course of his tenure in Bleach, he sought to break into the royal palace and kill the Soul King, usurping his position and sitting atop the throne of heaven. But why? Numerous different motives have been offered for Aizen's ambitions throughout the story, and as we've never been given a clear backstory for the character, a clear origin to show us how he got to where he is, at least not one that really shows us what spurred him on to becoming the man he is today, we can only really speculate. And it's actually quite fascinating, to be honest, the idea that the friendly, caring persona that he shared with the Gotei 13 for many years was always a facade, and was never, at least according to him, the true version of himself. And instead we're led to believe that the scheming, evil, power-hungry Aizen is in fact his real nature. But the truth is that we've never been offered even a glimpse at an alternative, or a genuine reason or peek behind the curtain as to why that might be, as to why that came to pass. And to be honest, that interests me a lot. Like I said, multiple different motives have been put forward, from a general dissatisfaction towards the status quo of the world, and realising he was truly one of the only people with the capability to enact real change, to Ichigo's observation that Aizen's desire to ultimately lose his powers stemmed from a subconscious sense of loneliness at the very top, all the way to Aizen simply being obsessed with pushing the boundaries of what's possible. It makes for, in many ways, a truly impenetrable character, and that's what I think draws so many people to Aizen as a villain. Many, including even Aizen himself, try to break this character wide open, but truthfully, there are no chinks in the armour, so to speak. And by the way, if you enjoyed today's video, do consider hitting subscribe down below, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and check out my Patreon as well if you want to help support the channel that extra step. Oh, and there will be some spoilers for the end of the 1000-Year Blood War arc in this video as well. So the primary questions today are: why did Aizen betray the Soul Society, and why did he try to become God? Because in truth, that's what it means to kill Reo and take the throne, to supplant himself as the new Soul King. This was revealed to be Aizen's ambition at the tail end of the Soul Society arc, as he escaped to Waco Mundo, and he then tried to carry out his plan in the Urahara arc. The funny thing is, though, we were operating without any context whatsoever. We didn't even know what the Soul King looked like in the Urahara arc, only that he existed, supposedly, again we had no real proof, somewhere and was protected by a royal guard. Of course, the 1000-Year Blood War arc would change all of that. At last we knew the truth behind Reo's existence, and that just served to make things weirder in retrospect. Aizen really yearned for this? The Soul King's existence is a miserable state of suspended animation at best, trapped forever between life and death. Again, in retrospect, it didn't really make any sense for Aizen to want this, especially with the revelation that he had in fact somehow seen the Soul King himself in the past, something that to this day has never been explained. But luckily, Aizen was no longer the main villain by this point of the story, and there was no longer a need to make his plan or his desire make sense anymore, since it was seemingly no longer attainable. Ultimately, Yhwach beats him to the punch and succeeds in killing the Soul King. Interestingly, Yhwach proves that it is possible to essentially subsume the role of the Soul King without having to be imprisoned, or, have all your limbs and organs removed. You can exist as a new Soul King, but we simply don't know enough about how this works. As far as I can tell, the only reason this was possible was because Yhwach has the unique ability to freely take power, and so he kept the world stable by literally taking his father's power when he killed him, essentially becoming the new Soul King, even if he wasn't able to take all of Adnias' power. Aizen can't do this, he can't just take power, so if he killed the Soul King, presumably the worlds would simply collapse until a solution was forced into place, by which I mean Ichibei forcibly substituting Reo for Aizen, but even then I don't think Aizen has anywhere near the power necessary to take on Adnias' role. But looking at why Aizen betrayed the Soul Society, well, that's a little murkier. And the Aizen of today would say that he never betrayed the Soul Society because he would have us believe that he was never technically allied with them at all. Noting that the Aizen they knew was an illusion, as he says in the Soul Society arc, and while that's clearly true to some extent, does that mean that he joined the Gotei 13 already with the ambition of one day turning against them? Or did Aizen eventually come to resent the current state of the world during the earliest days of his career as a Shinigami? To me, and this is only a guess, but it makes the most sense that his worldview would be completely flipped upside down when he somehow saw what the Soul King truly was. And at that point he realized he could no longer stomach living in this world, and began to formulate his plans. But again, that is just a guess. It's clear, though, that at least at some point during his scheming, he clearly did come to view himself, unironically, as a godlike figure, as he explicitly tells Shinji during their battle in the Fate Karakura Town arc. Now, whether that was a quality he felt was necessary in replacing Reo, or whether he simply became megalomaniacal over the years, is unclear. Unfortunately, Aizen's mind is very closed off from the reader, and I understand why. It enhances the mystique around the character, but it means we struggle to truly understand his view of the world and why he sees it that way. The brief insights that we do get are what we're going to discuss next, as we try to break down the specifics behind Aizen's motive and what drove him to do what he did, to take the path he ultimately walked. So then, what was Aizen's motive? We know he wanted to kill the Soul King and replace him, but why? The story never explicitly tells us, keeping Aizen's true feelings a mystery played very close to the chest, but it does offer up a variety of different explanations, some from Aizen himself, while others come from outside observers. The most orthodox and surface level of Aizen's motivations is simply the quest for greater power, or as he says to Ukitake in chapter 178, to seek greater heights, or to go ever higher. This is a man who has always been considerably stronger than virtually all of his peers. Even when he was a vice captain, Aizen was naturally capable of blocking a fully powered Hardo 88 fired by the Kido Corps captain of all characters with just a Danku, shocking Tessai himself. And of course in the Fate Karakura Town arc, Aizen cuts down every single member, pretty much, of the Gotei 13 and Vizard alliance with a single swing of his sword each time. So it makes a lot of sense to me why someone of that unusual, generational caliber would grow bored, they would grow tired, and they would reach a peak that felt stale, and so would naturally want to transgress elsewhere where they can, to look elsewhere, in order to see how far they can push their own potential. If you look at Yamamoto, probably the only pure Shinigami whose natural skill and power is higher than Aizen's. He was originally a ruthless and bloodthirsty warlord, a conqueror, but then he found a purpose, and poured all of that energy and strength into founding and running the Gotei 13. For Aizen, life is meandering by comparison. This also goes some way to explaining why he's obsessed with transcending the boundaries of Shinigami and Hollow, and evolving to become a new and greater life form. It's the constant pursuit of more, of never wanting to stop, of proving that the impossible is possible after all for those capable of achieving it. Aizen's iconic speech at the end of chapter 178 no longer feels particularly accurate to me or resonant of the character. He tells Ukitake that no one ever stood atop the heavens before, not you, not I, nor even the gods. But soon the unbearable vacancy of heaven's throne ends now. Now, I will stand at the top. Taken literally, this speech seems to imply, yes, that Aizen wants to become God, to become the one at the very top of the pecking order, of the hierarchy, the one who does in fact rule over absolutely everything. And I guess it can be retroactively fit to suggest that Aizen believes the throne of heaven is vacant due to the status of the Soul King himself, due to knowing what the Soul King actually is. There's also the idea of Aizen wanting to destroy or reshape the Soul Society itself as another possible motive for what he does, another driver for what he does. Now, it's pretty clear that Aizen doesn't want to literally bring about the end of the Soul Society in the same way Yhwach does. But there's also no denying that he feels, at least in its current iteration, it needs to be completely reworked. In chapter 314, as Aizen invades Karakura Town, he explicitly states his ambition as destroy Karakura Town, create the Oken, and bring down the Soul Society. In another translation, he talks of seeing the fall of Soul Society, and this is very similar to another line of his that comes much later on in chapter 406, as he finally exits his cocoon form and emerges in his new transcendent state. He says to Gin, "Now I can witness the end of the Soul Society with my own eyes." Normally, I would just attribute these to him defeating the Soul Society, but in chapter 314, and as he becomes a transcendent being later on, he explicitly lines it up with creating the Oken, which seems to imply, I don't know, that killing the Soul King would somehow bring down or be the end of the Soul Society, perhaps? I mean, I guess it literally would, but as I said a moment ago, I don't think Aizen is in the business of total genocide of the spirit world in the same way Yhwach is. So when he says the end of the Soul Society, I imagine the idea is to take it figuratively. Much later, in chapter 395, Aizen talks of executing Yamamoto specifically because he is the living embodiment of the Soul Society's history. Whereas we know that Aizen purposefully went out of his way to avoid killing the other captains. All of this seems to imply that Aizen has some personal issue or aggravation with the Soul Society itself, with the older generation, with the history of the Soul Society, especially since Yamamoto doesn't really have any connection to the Soul King at all, aside from being the Captain Commander, and so wanting him dead specifically feels, I would say, disjointed from wanting to create the Oken. Aizen could have just left for Karakura right then and there, pretty much, but instead, he wants to kill Yamamoto. He's out to finish him off. But then we get perhaps the juiciest morsel of Aizen's motive so far, and in many ways this was the big one. This seems to be our only real, I would say genuine look at how Aizen was truly feeling deep down about the state of the world, where he could finally let loose with someone he perceived to be an equal, of sorts anyway, at the very least someone who might be on the kind of level where they could see where he was coming from. In chapter 421, realizing his defeat is nigh, Aizen suddenly explodes at Urahara, who orchestrated his ultimate loss. Completely losing his composure, Aizen seems to at last drop the aloof facade and tell Kisuke how he really feels, screaming at him, telling the scientist that he despises him, which is quite a strong emotion for Aizen to feel when he seems to feel next to nothing towards virtually everyone else. Aizen doesn't understand how, with a mind as brilliant, he says, as Kisuke's, how can he simply accept the status quo? How can he continue to live obeying that thing? Kisuke immediately knows what Aizen means by that thing, realizing that he too has seen the Soul King at some point. Kisuke gives Aizen a very flat response, however, simply telling him that without the Soul King, the Soul Society would become divided, and everything would crumble, and that's just how the world is. It's this last line that really throws Aizen for a loop, as he roars at Kisuke, telling him that that's the logic of a loser, whereas a winner doesn't ask how the world is, but how it should be. Considering this is literally the chapter of his defeat, it was definitely way too late in the game to start giving us some real insight into Aizen's motivation, but it is fascinating all the same. And yes, I do think that this is genuinely the first actual glimpse, without any of the bravado, without any of the arrogance or the villainous monologues, this is the first actual glimpse into why Aizen was doing what he did. He clearly hates the Soul King, or what the Soul King is, having discovered its true nature and wanted to change the status quo. He wanted to remove what he believed was an unfit god, and replace it. It's for this reason that I think it's such a shame that Aizen plays such a small role, essentially, in the Thousand Year Blood War arc. He should have been involved when the Soul King was playing a big part in the story. As it stands, despite the fact that everyone is witnessing and interacting with the Soul King, which is a pretty huge deal, Aizen has very little to say about the entire thing. And what truly maddens Aizen is that he clearly also believes that Kisuke has the capability to do what he was trying to do, and yet Kisuke is more than content to just sit back and enjoy the world, or at least accept it for what it is. He even calls Kisuke the winner in his final tirade, but is appalled that he would instead live by the logic of what Aizen perceives to be a loser. It's interesting that Aizen seems so despondent with the state of the world that even he would want Kisuke to take up arms against it too, which seems to conflict, I would say, with his belief in being a god. Which again is why I think this is our only really genuine look at what Aizen actually wants at this point in the story. In that sense, Aizen was perhaps hoping for someone to understand him, and we'll get to that in a minute, but instead Kisuke rejects him and his beliefs. It does kind of go to show that if Aizen and Kisuke had seen eye to eye, they probably would have been able to accomplish literally anything. But I've said this before, it was never going to happen. Kisuke is very much a big picture guy. He's exactly the same as the likes of Kyoraku and Ichibei, two very powerful, very influential figures, all of whom will do everything in their power to ensure the world remains exactly as it is, even if it's unethical, even if it's morally questionable, and that's how Kisuke operates too, whereas Aizen is the total opposite. He will do everything in his power, even if it's unethical, even if it's morally questionable, to change the world from the way it currently is. And so Aizen is the outlier. He's the rogue element who disagreed with what he saw and tried to force real change through brutal, bloody, and, let's face it, wrong means. But it's clear that the narrative is pretty much flat out telling us that to rebel against the system, against the established order, in the way Aizen is trying to do so, is the wrong route to take, the wrong thing to do, and Aizen is ultimately defeated and punished. Now, I look at this sequence, at least the Viz translation anyway, which I know isn't necessarily the most accurate, and I can't help but think Kisuke's response is pretty weird. From the way it's worded, he talks of the Soul King as though its influence is a metaphorical thing, that the truth of the Soul King keeps the people united, the false truth that they've essentially all been fed. Kisuke talks as though Aizen revealing the reality of the king would divide the society itself and split the populace, by which I assume he means it would maybe incite riots, it would instigate a change in the world order. Whereas we come to learn later on that everything would quite literally crumble as the three worlds would collapse into one another. Now here's where things get interesting. I can't quite remember, and all of the different translations I've read over the years have done a bit of a number on me, I think, in this regard. When in the story did we first learn that killing Rayo would collapse the three worlds? Because as far as I can remember, it was a fairly recent revelation. Like, maybe only as of the Thousand Year Blood War arc? What I'm getting at is, I'm not sure Kubo had fully laid out what it would mean to kill the Soul King by the time Kisuke and Aizen had this chat. We knew from very, very early on that the Quincy's were affecting the balance of the world by killing hollows en masse, but it had nothing to do with Rayo, nothing to do with him. Unless, in another translation of chapter 421, Kisuke tells Aizen that the worlds would collapse more literally. But yes, crucially, I think chapter 421 gives us the absolute clearest look at why Aizen wanted to commit such treasonous crimes, and finally does lift the lid. It removes the veil from this character, even if only for a few pages at most, before he kind of goes back to being his normal self in chapter 423. The next chapter, 422, gives us a different perspective. Ichigo relays to Kisuke that he could feel loneliness ebbing from Aizen's sword, and he wonders if maybe Aizen wished subconsciously to lose his powers in order to become just another Shinigami. Ichigo notes that if Aizen was born with exceptional power, perhaps he just wanted another person who could see things from his perspective, and when he gave up searching for that, he instead just wished to be an ordinary Shinigami instead. Now, maybe this is a hot take, but I've never been sure how to actually feel about this, and I can't help but think that even if Kubo believed this at the time, that I think he then changed his mind on this character development later on. Again, I'm only speculating, but Ichigo is very idealistic, and I've always thought Kisuke's expression in this scene is supposed to offer the other side of the coin, that he's not sure he believes him, or he believes that Aizen is capable of that, even subconsciously. Because I'm also not sure it really makes sense. You know, Ichigo talks about Aizen wanting to lose his powers because he never found someone who could see things from his perspective at that kind of level of power. Here, meaning the power he gained via the Hogyoku. But if that's true, even without that power, he's still one of the single most powerful Shinigami in existence by far, and as of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, has only grown stronger still during his imprisonment. Which is what makes me think Kubo is taking the character in a different direction following his return in the final arc. Again, the key thing to remember about this moment, about Ichigo's explanation, or his thoughts anyway, his own theories, is that everything here is subconscious. The idea is that even Aizen himself isn't necessarily thinking or believing this about himself, but it's just a desire that exists somewhere in his heart, that permeates his very soul. Ultimately, this isn't really a motivation either, it's just another insight into a part of the character that is kept mostly entirely closed off. I like that we actually do get a glimpse of a child Aizen here as well. That's very interesting, dressed as a Shinigami, which does imply he's been a member of the Gotei 13 for a very long time. Maybe he was even born into it. And then finally, at the very end of the manga, in chapter 682, as Aizen prepares to duel Urahara, we seem to get a concrete, if fleeting and last-minute, affirmation of his ultimate motive, one that does connect to what he said to Kisuke in chapter 421. As Urahara notes that he can't imagine how fighting for the sake of the Soul Society would benefit Aizen in any way, Aizen replies that it isn't about benefit. Rather, his only purpose has always been to crush all who seek to control him. I believe in a different translation that I remember reading back in the day, he said it was to crush all who would seek to rule over him. Essentially the same thing, you get the gist. In the Viz translation, Aizen says that crushing those who seek to control me is always the only reason I take action. This is a very interesting snippet for Kubo to just add in here at the end of the story, as it feels like his attempt to put a cap on Aizen's motivation once and for all. And it does make a lot of sense. In fact, I'd argue this one line basically explains every villainous action Aizen has ever made, save, maybe, for the holification experiments. But he murders the Central 46, the Soul Society's government body. He tries to kill Yamamoto specifically, before also wanting to kill the Soul King, and finally he allies with the Shinigami specifically due to wanting to crush Urahara, who I guess would have eventually tried to control him. It's simplified, yes, especially in comparison to the revelation in chapter 421, but I think it works, and it makes sense that this is the character's ultimate motivation and why he ultimately betrayed the Soul Society and tried to become God. He seeks to drag down and crush all who would try to control and rule over him. Alright, but that's it for today's video, guys. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it. This is the first in a new series on the channel called Bleach Lore, so I do hope you enjoyed it, and let me know what other major Bleach Lore questions you'd like to see looked at next. One last reminder, do consider hitting subscribe down below if you enjoyed today's video, as it does help out the channel an awful lot. And also check out my Patreon as well, where you can support the channel there for as little as $1 a month, and that does go a very, very long way. And as always, a massive thank you and a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, whose support is helping to keep the lights on here on the channel, and it does mean absolutely everything, so thank you all so very much. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.